I had two heroes in my life growing up. They were both characters in my dad's stories, and if you have immigrant parents, you know that immigrant dads only have two stories, and they tell them over and over and over again. Those two characters were Jimmy Carter and my grandfather. Because of the fascinating details of these individuals' lives, I found a love for government and a love for community. And today, as those two things feel like opposites, I want to find a way to bring them back together, because we all know how important that is in a time like right now. My dad found inspiration in the story of Jimmy Carter, a man who left the Navy to save his family farm. In the 70s, when my dad came to the United States, Jimmy Carter became one of his first role models. Now, I thought this was because both of them have accents that no one can really understand, but instead, it was because both of them fought very tough journeys of life through entrepreneurship. My dad is an entrepreneur. He would never call himself that, but he is, just like Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, for him, and ultimately me, taught us what it meant to be in public service. My parents used to say that we have to love and respect those who choose a career in government, because it's an honor and it's a sacrifice. My other hero was my grandfather. My grandfather lived in a very small village in India, in Punjab, and he was a teacher. And every single night, my grandfather would go from home to home to home to ask if his neighbors had eaten. And after he found out whether they've eaten, he asked if they had any food left over. And if they did, he took that food and hand-delivered it to the homes that had nothing. Oftentimes, the places that he took food from was his own home. This sense of community, the idea that a person is so much bigger than their individual self, is something that's been instilled in me from a very young age. That communities stick together to thrive, even or especially if they're poor. My dad used to say that if Jimmy Carter and my grandfather ever met one another, they would be the best of friends. But the idea today of even a government official and a community activist being in the same room sounds preposterous. The two things I love are at odds. Government has stopped listening to the people it serves, and we, the people, have stopped engaging and trusting our government. And we can see this in cities like Flint. In Flint, Michigan, poisonous water was funneled through two filters, zip code and privilege. And government officials got together and recognized this as a crisis. They said, we gotta do something about this. And they said, we're gonna bring the community together and let them know what it is that we did. And when they brought people together, the community had something very important to say in return. They said, how could we possibly drink this water? How can we trust you again? Across the country, less than 20% of people trust their government today. A historic low. So what happened? Right now, on the heels of a national election, is the perfect time to start this conversation. But what will really matter is what happens when the election is over. When the balloons have dropped along with the microphones, and our TVs change from present-day rallies to past episodes of The West Wing, will we keep the conversation going? Because that's where we have an opportunity to build trust again. Trust starts with empathy, and empathy comes with us seeing each other more. So government, we can't just see you at the inconveniently located 3 p.m. town hall meeting or the next ribbon cutting. We gotta see you at the barbecue. We got to see you at the school board meeting. We are the center of your world when it's election time. But the second the cameras are off, you cheat on us with Becky with the Fortune 500 company. I ain't sorry. Government spends a disproportionate amount of time fundraising rather than being in the communities that they serve. And there's this over-reliance on data as if that will tell us everything. But data and technology will never be a replacement for human interaction because people are not data points. They're individuals wrapped up in cultures and traditions. Data is meant to show us how we engage with one another, not whether we do it at all. Presidential advisor and economist Larry Summers wrote an incredible piece on government trust. And in that piece, he writes about Mayor Menino of Boston. And he would say, I would go to schoolyards and playgrounds with Mayor Menino, and the mayor would go and look for holes in the fences or tiles that were missing on the floor. And Summers said, it seemed odd and micromanaging, but eventually he concluded that people's faith in government to be able to do big things relies on whether they can execute on routine responsibilities. Now, while I believe this to be true, that we want government leaders that are effective and efficient, I'm not so sure that's why people loved Mayor Menino, who, by the way, was told to be more popular than kittens, according to one study. I think people loved Mayor Menino because he was at the school in the first place, that he saw that there were missing tiles. Because I don't think what we want in government leaders is perfection. I believe what we want is authenticity. And people have lost trust with institutions, including government, and it shows. In 2014, the United States had the lowest voter turnout it has had in 72 years. In the top 22 cities, voter turnout ranged from a mere 7% and couldn't even cross 50%. There was an official in Philadelphia that was remembered for saying, "We should pop champagne if we cross 25%. And for my friends who are watching, that is not a Drake lyric. That was an actual quote. If you look to your left and you look to your right, chances are 2 out of 3 of you have never voted in a local election. But there is a 100% chance that the decisions that were made at a local level have affected your life. So we have to vote. Not just in this presidential, but we gotta vote for our mayors. We gotta vote for our governors and our sheriffs and our attorney generals. And your voice matters. The current mayor of Atlanta was brought in on an election that was decided by 714 votes. That's smaller than most Indian weddings. Don't get any hints, Mom. It is our responsibility to vote because so many people have fought for that right. But we gotta know what we're voting for. We can't just throw up our hands and say, "Thanks, Obama," or "I'm socially liberal but fiscally conservative," as an excuse for not knowing what it is that government does, or maybe more importantly, what government does not do. These moments are so important for us to vote. And when we find out about elected officials, we gotta go tell it to 10 friends. That could be an awkward dinner fact, or I know we got artists in the audience because we're in Atlanta. Go spray paint it on government property, because that's definitely a way to get government and community in the same room together. And community building is a two-way street. Government can't and should not do it alone. Amazing things happen when people are brought to the solution building table. And the best way really to explain this is through my dating life. When I was in college, I used to take all of my dates to the same restaurant. It was a noodle joint. Okay, I took 2 of my dates to that restaurant. It was a noodle joint where you would put your noodles in the bowl, you would mix up a bunch of vegetables, add some funky sauces, and then they would mix it up for you and bring it out to your plate, the food you had made. But I took people there for one specific reason, because no one would ever say that the food was bad. Why? Because they made it. And no one likes to say that the food that they made doesn't taste good. And this is no different than our noodles of legislation. Because when you involve us or you engage us, even if the outcome is not perfect, we will see the good in it before we see the bad. On a more serious note, when Ferguson happened, it rattled our cities. And here in Atlanta, people were asking, what happens when there's a police-involved shooting in my city? So our organization, the Center for Civic Innovation, brought together police officers, attorneys, and protesters into one room to have a conversation about the grand jury process within our city. The police officers came in on the defensive. They said, people don't understand what it means to be a police officer, that most officers are good. And the protesters came in on the offensive, saying, we still aren't heard. And they repeated disturbing stereotypes and statistics. But when the two started talking, the conversation was beautiful. The protesters talked about the fact that they felt that their lives didn't and still don't matter. That protesting is not just a form of disruption, but that it's also a form of healing. And the police officers took us to uncut scenes that don't make it to television or on our feeds, of police officers dropping to their knees, sobbing and praying because the life they tried to save was not. We didn't all leave that room agreeing on everything, but we left with perspective that is going to help us actually achieve the types of solutions that we want to build. And that is what I am so excited about. That opportunity for government and people to come together to solve systemic challenges. And it's happening. In San Francisco, a legislation was passed to help an organization like Green Streets get started. Green Streets creates jobs for young people to sort recycling in their own neighborhoods and keep their neighborhoods the way they want it to be. Or there's other opportunities for government to engage with people by just saying what we're doing isn't working. And they could partner with organizations like Rising Foundations in New Orleans to break cycles of generational incarceration. Now, look, we can lose trust with institutions, but we rebuild that trust with people. And we do it every day. When we would rather go from point A to point B in a stranger's car, or stay in someone's home that we don't know rather than stay in a hotel. These innovations are innovative not because of the technology. They're innovative because of their power to build trust. So imagine if we could use the same mindset and the same tools that we use to build smarter cities and apply that to build equitable ones. What would happen? And we don't have to look far to see what would. There are groups like Gangsters to Growers right here in Atlanta that help recently incarcerated men learn to grow food and then sell that food into all of the restaurants that we enjoy and love. Or groups like Soul Food Cypher that use the power of hip-hop and ciphers to talk about mental health and challenges that young people are facing in their communities. What these organizations show us is that communities already have the talent and the assets that they need to solve challenges that they're facing. And these mission-driven organizations not only solve a social problem, but they are economic drivers for our cities. They create jobs, and they also save governments a ton of money. Now, what prevents us from moving forward is all the infighting that happens within government and the polarization between people. Elections do this the best. They Super Bowlerize our feelings. You're on one team or you're on the other. But when that election is over, we're left with the impact of that division. All of the jabs that we took or the insults that we threw out to divide me from you, that's what holds us back when the spotlight is off. Because elections themselves are just a moment. But change and trust requires a movement. And we can't get so caught up in trying to create a moment that we forget what it takes to make a movement. And movements are hard, and they're imperfect. When the founding fathers got together in Philadelphia to discuss what the future of this country would be, they debated and argued back and forth on what it would look like. But it wasn't elected officials or government leaders alone that had that conversation. In that room were also teachers, doctors, farmers, lawyers, what I like to call social entrepreneurs, people whose opinions created a document that became the law of our land. And while that document is so important, it was imperfect. And that same document was amended 27 times by women who didn't have the right to vote, by African Americans who compromised 2/5 of their dignity. So what would our constitutional convention look like today? Who would be in the room having that conversation? Who have we left out? Because solutions built for us, without us, are not for us. Everything comes back to my two heroes. Jimmy Carter taught us that government can be good. It can be a partner, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be real. And my grandfather taught us about community strength and the ability for communities to self-heal. I know that we're all going to be devastated the day we lose Jimmy Carter. But I also know wherever he goes, he's going to have a friend in my grandfather. Because when two people are honest, even a government leader and a community activist can be the best of friends. Thank you.